The rain hammered down on Tokyo's grimy streets, each drop carrying the weight of 1,000 broken dreams. In the narrow alley behind the Starlight Diner, pulled his worn military jacket around his shoulders and stepped deeper into the shadows. The cybernetic leg that had replaced his real one 3 years ago clicked softly against the wet pavement with each careful step. He'd been walking for hours now, avoiding the main streets where the police drones might scan his identification chip and flag him as another homeless veteran. The war against the Empire had ended 5 years ago, but for soldiers like, the battle never truly stopped. It just moved from distant planets to the cold streets of Earth. That's when he heard it, a soft whimpering sound coming from behind a cluster of garbage containers. Froze, his enhanced hearing picking up the subtle differences in the noise. This wasn't human crying. The frequency was all wrong, too melodic, too musical. Against his better judgment, approached the sound. What he found made his breath catch in his throat. Huddled between two overflowing dumpsters was a creature he'd only seen in military briefings and classified alien species databases. A draconian female, her once magnificent scales now dulled to a sickly gray-green, her wings folded tight against her emaciated frame. Her clothes were nothing more than tattered rags, and her golden eyes held an emptiness that recognized all too well. The dragon woman looked up at him with a mixture of fear and resignation. In heavily accented English, barely above a whisper, she spoke words that hit like a plasma rifle to the chest. "I'm worthless, but I can cook." Stared at her for a long moment. During the war, Draconians had been the enemy's most feared shock troops. Their natural fire-breathing abilities, combined with their incredible strength and near-impenetrable scales, had made them nightmare opponents on the battlefield. He'd watched these creatures tear through entire human battalions without breaking a sweat. But this one was broken, just like him. "When's the last time you ate?" asked, crouching down to her level. The dragon woman flinched away from him, her survival instincts still sharp despite her obvious weakness. 3-4 days, she admitted, her voice barely audible above the rain. "The soup kitchen. They don't serve my kind. Too dangerous, they say." Knew that feeling, too dangerous, too unstable, too much of a liability. How many times had he heard those words since coming home? "What's your name?" he asked gently. She replied, then quickly added, "Former flame singer of the 3rd Draconian Legion. Service number." "No, that doesn't matter anymore, does it?" "Former Staff Sergeant, Terran Defense Force, 47th Mechanized Infantry," replied automatically. "And you're wrong, it always matters." Something shifted in his golden eyes, a spark of recognition, perhaps even respect. Two soldiers meeting in the wasteland that their homecoming had become. "You said you can cook," continued, struggling to his feet as his cybernetic leg protested against the damp. "What kind of cooking?" For the first time, his expression brightened slightly. "Traditional draconian flame cuisine, molecular gastronomy using controlled plasma heating. I can prepare foods that your human palates have never experienced, proteins restructured at the atomic level, flavors that exist in spectrums your tongue isn't even designed to taste." Blinked. He'd been expecting maybe some basic food preparation skills, but this sounded like something from the high-end restaurants in the city's elite districts. "Where did you learn that?" "Before the war, I was training to become a flame chef in the royal kitchens of Draconis Prime. It was my dream." Her voice grew distant. "But then the Empire called for soldiers, and my flame-singing abilities made me valuable for combat instead of creation." The rain continued to fall around them, and made a decision that would have seemed insane to any rational person. But rationality had abandoned him long ago, somewhere between the battlefield trauma and the endless rejections from potential employers who saw his service record as a liability rather than an asset. "There's a diner about 6 blocks from here," he said, extending his hand toward. "The owner's an old friend of mine, another vet. He might be willing to give you a chance." Stared at his outstretched hand as if it were some alien artifact. You would help me, even though I'm—" "A soldier who's fallen on hard times," interrupted. "Yeah, I would, because I know exactly what that feels like." Slowly, carefully, reached out and took his hand. Her scales were surprisingly warm despite the cold rain, and could feel the barely contained power in her grip, the strength that could crush steel beams held in perfect, gentle control. As they walked through the neon-lit streets toward Tony's all-night diner, found himself thinking about the war in ways he hadn't for months. He remembered the propaganda, the speeches about human superiority, the way they'd been taught to see draconians as monsters. But walking beside, listening to her quiet footsteps and the occasional soft comment about the architecture they passed, realized how much of that had been lies. "Why are you helping me?" asked as they stopped at a crosswalk, the holographic traffic signals casting colored light across her face. Was quiet for a moment, watching the automated vehicles glide silently through the intersection. "Because someone should have helped me when I needed it. But they didn't. Maybe if they had, I wouldn't have spent the last 2 years sleeping in shelters and begging for work." "The war changed you," observed. It wasn't a question. "The war changed all of us," replied. "The question is what we do with that change." They reached Tony's diner just as the late-night crowd was starting to thin out. Through the rain-streaked windows, could see his old friend wiping down tables with the methodical precision of someone who'd been in the restaurant business for decades. Tony had served in the same unit as for the first 2 years of the war before an injury sent him home early. Unlike, Tony had managed to build something positive from his military experience. "Stay here for a minute," told, gesturing toward a covered area beside the diner's entrance. "Let me talk to him first." Pushed through the diner's front door, and the familiar smell of coffee and bacon hit him like a warm embrace. Tony looked up from his cleaning and broke into a huge grin. "Man, it's been weeks. How you holding up?" "Been better, been worse," replied honestly. "Tony, I need to ask you for a favor, a big one." Tony's expression grew serious. During their time in the service, that phrase had usually preceded a request that involved significant risk or moral complexity. "What do you need?" Took a deep breath. "There's a draconian refugee outside, former soldier like us. She's homeless, starving, and she claims she can cook. Really cook, not just basic food prep." Tony's eyebrows shot up. "A dragon, you know I can't." "She's dying, Tony," interrupted. "Slowly starving to death in an alley because nobody will give her a chance. She's a veteran just like us. She bled for her people just like we bled for ours." Tony was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching his face. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious. Give her one night. One chance to prove what she can do. If she can't deliver, I'll make sure she moves on quietly. No trouble for you." "And if she can deliver?" Hadn't thought that far ahead. "Then maybe we all get a second chance." Tony sighed heavily, the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. "Bring her in. But if this goes sideways, if there's any trouble with customers or the authorities." "It won't," promised, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. Stepped back outside and found exactly where he'd left her, standing perfectly still despite the continuing rain. Her military training was evident in the way she held herself, alert, ready, but non-threatening. "He'll see you," announced. "One chance to show what you can do." His eyes widened with something that might have been hope. You actually convinced him." "Veterans stick together," said simply. "Come on." As they walked into the diner together, noticed how every conversation stopped. The handful of late-night customers, truckers, shift workers, insomniacs seeking refuge in coffee and companionship, all turned to stare at. Some expressions showed fear, others curiosity, but all reflected the deep social conditioning that had taught humans to see draconians as threats. Tony emerged from behind the counter, moving with the careful neutrality he'd perfected during years of dealing with difficult customers. "You must be's friend," he said, extending his hand toward. Looked at the offered hand for a moment before reaching out to shake it with the same careful control had felt earlier. Thank you for this opportunity." "Don't thank me yet," Tony replied. "The kitchen's through here, show me what you've got." As they moved toward the kitchen, settled into a booth where he could watch through the service window. What happened next would determine not just fate, but perhaps the trajectory of all their lives. In the kitchen, stood perfectly still for several minutes, her golden eyes taking in every detail of the equipment, the layout, the available ingredients. Tony watched her with the patience of someone who understood that good preparation was the foundation of any successful operation. "Your flame temperature?" Tony asked, gesturing toward the various cooking surfaces. "Adjustable from 200 to 3,000 degrees Celsius, replied quietly. "Focused or dispersed, continuous or pulsed. I can work with any heat source, but my natural flames allow for precision that your human technology cannot match." Tony nodded slowly. "Show me." moved to the prep station, and selected ingredients with the deliberate care of someone who understood that this moment would define her future. Vegetables, proteins, spices, each item chosen not just for flavor, but for the chemical reactions that would occur under precisely controlled heat application. Then she began to cook. What witnessed through the service window was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Its movements were a fusion of martial arts precision and artistic grace. Her flames danced across ingredients with surgical accuracy, causing molecules to restructure in ways that conventional cooking could never achieve. The aroma that began to fill the diner was indescribable. It was familiar yet completely alien, comforting yet exciting. Conversations that had stopped when entered slowly resumed, but now the customers were turning toward the kitchen with expressions of genuine curiosity rather than fear. "What the hell is she making?" one of the truckers asked, his nose twitching as he tried to identify the complex layers of scent. Didn't have an answer. He was watching transform simple diner ingredients into something that belonged in the galaxy's finest restaurants. Her flames created colors in the food that shouldn't have existed, blues and purples and shades of gold that seemed to shift and move in the light. 30 minutes later, placed 3 plates on the service counter. Flame-kissed earth proteins with quantum-enhanced vegetables and molecular aromatics, she announced quietly. Tony approached the plates with the skepticism of someone who'd eaten thousands of meals and thought he'd seen everything. He cut a small piece of what had once been ordinary chicken breast and took a careful bite. His expression changed immediately. His eyes widened, then closed as he savored flavors that his human palate was struggling to process. When he opened them again, could see something approaching wonder in his friend's face. "This is," Tony started, then stopped. He took another bite, larger this time. "How is this possible?" "Controlled plasma heating allows for precise molecular restructuring," explained. "The proteins are enhanced at the atomic level, creating flavor compounds that don't exist in nature. The vegetables are quantum-locked at their peak nutritional and taste profiles." One by one, the late-night customers approached the counter, drawn by aromas that seemed to speak directly to their genetic memory of what food should be. Tony, still in a state of amazement, decided to let them taste small samples. The reactions were unanimous: amazement, delight, and a hunger for more that went beyond mere appetite. "Lady, I've been eating diner food for 30 years, one of the truckers said too, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. "This is the best meal I've ever had in my life." Scales seemed to brighten slightly, the first sign of life had seen in her since their meeting in the alley. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It brings me joy to create nourishment for others." As the last customer left the diner well past midnight, Tony locked the front door and turned to face and. His expression was thoughtful, calculating, but not unkind. "I've got a proposition," he said finally. "My night cook quit last week. Job's yours if you want it. Minimum wage to start, but if you can do this kind of work consistently." He gestured toward the empty plates that customers had practically licked clean. "We'll talk about profit sharing." His entire body seemed to sag with relief. You're offering me employment." "I'm offering you a chance to show the world what you can do," Tony corrected. "But I need to know you're reliable, consistent, and that you can work with human ingredients and equipment." "I can adapt any recipe to available resources," assured him. "And she paused, her voice growing thick with emotion. "I have nowhere else to go. This job, this opportunity, it means everything to me." Watched the exchange with a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, not just but for the possibility that the divisions created by war didn't have to be permanent. That soldiers on both sides could find ways to build something positive from the wreckage of their shared trauma. "There's a small apartment above the diner," Tony continued. "It's not much, but it's got a bed, a bathroom, and it's warm. You can stay there as long as you're working here." His golden eyes filled with tears. Actual tears, realized, not so different from human crying despite her reptilian features. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "Cook like you did tonight," Tony replied simply. "That's all the thanks I need." As they prepared to leave for the night, Felt's gentle touch on his arm. "You saved my life tonight," she said. "Why?" Looked at her for a long moment, thinking about his own long journey from the battlefield to this moment. "Because everyone deserves a second chance. And because maybe helping you helps heal something broken in all of us." Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The city's neon lights reflected in the puddles, creating patterns of color that reminded of the way flames had danced across the food she'd prepared. For the first time in months, he felt something approaching peace. As they walked through the quiet streets, spoke softly about her plans. Recipes she wanted to try, ways she could improve the diner's menu, dreams she'd thought were dead forever. Listened and found himself smiling. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new prejudices to overcome, new barriers to break down. But tonight, a homeless dragon woman had been given the chance to cook again, and somehow that felt like the beginning of something important. The war had taken so much from all of them, but maybe, just maybe, they could build something better from what remained. 3 weeks had passed since began working at Tony's all-night diner, and hardly recognized the place. What had once been a simple roadside eatery frequented by truckers and night shift workers had transformed into something approaching a culinary destination. Word of the Dragon Chef had spread through the city's underground networks, first among veterans who understood the significance of giving former enemies a second chance, then among food enthusiasts who cared more about taste than politics. Sat in his usual booth, nursing a cup of coffee and watching work through the service window. Her movements had become even more precise over the past weeks, her confidence growing with each successfully completed order. The gray pallor had left her scales, replaced by a healthy shimmer that caught the kitchen lights. Her golden eyes, once dull with despair, now burned with the focused intensity of someone who had rediscovered their purpose. The diner was busier than had ever seen it. Every table was occupied despite the early morning hour, and a small line of customers waited patiently by the entrance. These weren't the usual late-night stragglers. These were people who had made deliberate pilgrimages to experience cooking. At a corner table, a food blogger from the Tokyo Times typed furiously on her tablet while photographing her meal. At the counter, 2 off-duty police officers ate in companionable silence, their initial skepticism about dining alongside an alien forgotten in the face of perfectly prepared quantum-enhanced eggs. But could see the strain in his posture. She was working 14-hour shifts, trying to handle the increased demand single-handedly while learning to navigate the complex social dynamics of a species she'd once fought against. Every interaction required careful calibration. Too friendly and humans got nervous, too distant, and they felt unwelcome. Tony emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He slid into the booth across from with the weary satisfaction of a business owner watching his establishment succeed beyond his wildest dreams. "Revenue's up 300%, Tony said quietly. "I've had to order ingredients I never heard of, and my suppliers think I've lost my mind, but we're actually turning a real profit for the first time in years." And asked. "Working herself to death," Tony admitted. "I've tried to get her to take breaks, but she acts like every moment away from the kitchen is a threat to her position here. Yesterday, I caught her sleeping, standing up against the prep counter." Nodded grimly. He recognized the behavior, the desperate overcompensation of someone who'd learned that their value as a person was directly tied to their productivity. He'd done the same thing during his first civilian job after the war, working until he collapsed rather than risk being seen as unreliable. "She needs help," observed. "I know, but finding someone who can work with her, that's complicated." Before could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A group of protesters had gathered outside, their signs visible through the diner's front windows. "Earth for humans," one sign read. "No alien workers," proclaimed another. Through the glass, could see the protesters' leader, a tall man with the rigid posture and suspicious eyes that associated with the human supremacist movements that had gained traction since the war's end. The man was speaking to a news crew, gesturing emphatically toward the diner while his followers chanted behind him. "This has been building for days," Tony said grimly. "Phone calls, online threats, someone leaked immigration status to the press." Felt a familiar tension building in his chest, the same fight-or-flight response that had kept him alive on a dozen battlefields. "What's her status?" "Refugee asylum pending," Tony replied. "Technically legal, but bureaucratic hell. She's got a work permit, but it could be revoked if there's enough political pressure." Through the service window, could see that had noticed the protesters. Her movements in the kitchen had become sharp, mechanical, the same controlled precision she'd probably used during combat operations. But could see the fear in the set of her shoulders, the way her flames flickered with unstable intensity. The protesters' chanting grew louder. Some of the diner's customers were glancing nervously toward the windows and could feel the comfortable atmosphere beginning to shift toward something more volatile. That's when the kitchen door opened and stepped into the dining area. The conversations died immediately. Every eye in the diner turned toward the dragon woman who stood perfectly still in the doorway, her golden gaze taking in the crowd of humans who had come to eat her food. For a moment, thought she might retreat back to the kitchen. Instead, she moved forward with the deliberate courage of someone who had decided that running was no longer an option. "My name is," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its quiet tone. "3 weeks ago, I was starving in an alley, convinced that I had no value to anyone. These humans," she gestured toward Tony, and gave me a chance to prove otherwise. The food blogger had stopped typing. The off-duty police officers had turned on their stools to face her directly. Even the protesters outside seemed to have paused their chanting to watch through the windows. "I know what many of you are thinking," continued. "I was your enemy. I fought against your people, killed your soldiers, burned your cities. These things are true, and I cannot change them." Felt his chest tighten. This wasn't how he'd expected to handle the situation. She was supposed to deflect, to minimize her past, to make herself seem less threatening. "But I want to tell you what war took from me," said, her flames dimming slightly. "It took my home, my family, my future as a chef. It turned my gift for creation into a weapon for destruction. It taught me that my value lay in how much damage I could inflict rather than how much joy I could create." She moved toward the counter and noticed that several customers instinctively shifted away from her. Noticed too, but she didn't stop moving. "When the war ended, I thought my life was over. I had no skills except killing, no purpose except following orders that would never come again. I spent 2 years believing I was worthless, that the galaxy would be better off if I simply disappeared." The diner was completely silent now. Outside, the protesters had stopped chanting entirely, pressing closer to the windows to hear what was being said inside. "Then this man," looked directly at, "found me in an alley and saw something other than a monster. He saw a soldier who was struggling with the same demons that haunted him. He gave me the chance to remember who I was before the war turned me into something else." Reached the counter and picked up a plate that held one of her signature dishes, quantum-enhanced proteins arranged in a pattern that seemed to shift and flow like living art. "This is who I am," she said, holding the plate up for everyone to see. "I am someone who creates nourishment, who transforms simple ingredients into experiences that bring joy. I am someone who cooks." She set the plate down and looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "You don't have to forgive me for what I did during the war. You don't have to trust me or like me or accept me. But I hope you'll judge me by what I do now, not just by what I was forced to become then." For several seconds, nobody moved. Then the food blogger began typing again, faster than before. One of the police officers turned back to his meal with a thoughtful expression. An elderly woman at a corner table raised her hand slightly. "Miss," the woman said in a voice that carried the authority of advanced age, "my grandson died fighting your people on 7. I came here tonight because I wanted to see the face of someone who might have killed him." Held his breath. This could go very wrong very quickly. "But," the woman continued, "your food reminds me of something my grandmother used to cook when I was young, something that made me feel safe and loved. I don't understand how that's possible, but thank you for that memory." The tension in the room shifted subtly. Not gone, but transformed into something more complex, a mixture of curiosity, caution, and grudging respect. Outside, the protesters' leader had stopped speaking to the news crew. He was staring through the window with an expression couldn't quite read. Anger, confusion, and perhaps something approaching uncertainty. Bowed slightly toward the elderly woman. "I am sorry for your loss," she said. "I cannot undo the pain that this war caused, but I can promise that I will never again use my abilities to harm others." She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, but paused at the doorway. "For anyone who wants to leave because you're uncomfortable eating food prepared by someone like me, I understand completely. Tony will provide full refunds, no questions asked." Nobody moved toward the exit. As disappeared back into the kitchen, conversations slowly resumed throughout the diner. But the atmosphere had changed fundamentally. People were talking to each other across tables that had been islands of isolation minutes before. The elderly woman was showing photos of her grandson to the police officers. The food blogger was interviewing other customers about their experiences. Realized that something remarkable had just happened. Hadn't tried to minimize her past or make excuses for her actions during the war. Instead, she'd acknowledged the full weight of what she'd done while demonstrating who she had chosen to become. It was a level of moral courage that wasn't sure he could have managed himself. Tony slid back into the booth looking stunned. Did she just change everything? Finished. Yeah, I think she did. Outside, the protesters were packing up their signs. Their leader was arguing with some of his followers, several of whom seemed reluctant to leave. The news crew was interviewing customers as they exited the diner, and from their expressions, suspected the story wouldn't be what the protesters had intended. Over the next hour, watched the diner's dynamics continue to evolve. Customers who had initially been nervous began requesting specific dishes and asking questions about her cooking techniques. A few even ventured into the kitchen to watch her work, returning to their tables with expressions of amazement. But the most significant change was in herself. Her movements had regained their fluid grace, her flames burned steady and bright, and when she occasionally emerged from the kitchen to check on customers, she did so with quiet confidence rather than fearful deference. Around midnight, as the last customers finished their meals, approached the kitchen, was cleaning her prep station with the methodical thoroughness of someone who took professional pride in maintaining her workspace. That was incredibly brave, told her. Looked up from her work. It was incredibly necessary, she replied. I realized tonight that I had been trying to earn acceptance by making myself smaller, less threatening, less authentic, but you can't build genuine relationships on a foundation of deception. Even if it costs you this job. Especially if it costs me this job, said firmly. I would rather fail as myself than succeed as someone else's acceptable version of what I should be. Nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He'd spent months after the war trying to be the person he thought civilians wanted him to be, stable, grateful, uncomplicated. It had been exhausting and ultimately unsuccessful. Tony wants to hire another cook, said, someone to help with the increased volume. I know, he's mentioned it several times. His expression grew thoughtful. I've been resistant because I was afraid that bringing in someone else would diminish my value here, but tonight helped me realize that my value isn't dependent on being irreplaceable. Any thoughts on who he should hire? Was quiet for several minutes, her hands moving automatically as she finished her cleaning routine. Finally, she looked up with an expression that was both hopeful and determined. What about you? Blinked me, I'm not a cook. No, but you're someone who understands what it means to start over. You're someone who saw potential in me when I couldn't see it in myself. Set down her cleaning cloth and faced him directly. Tony needs someone who can work with both human customers and alien staff. You have military experience, which means you understand operations and logistics. Most importantly, you're someone I trust. The suggestion hit like a revelation. For months, he'd been looking for employment that matched his military skill set: security work, logistics coordination, technical support. But most employers saw his PTSD diagnosis and service record as liabilities rather than assets. Working in a restaurant had never occurred to him, but as he thought about it, realized that many of the skills were transferable. Leadership, crisis management, working under pressure, coordinating complex operations with multiple moving parts. I don't know anything about the restaurant business, said slowly. Neither did I 3 weeks ago, replied. But I knew how to cook and you know how to lead. Tony could teach us both the business side. Before could respond, Tony emerged from his office with a stack of receipts and the satisfied expression of someone who just reconciled a very positive day's earnings. We need to talk about expanding the menu, he began, then noticed standing in the kitchen. Perfect timing. I wanted to thank you again for bringing here. Tonight was... He shook his head in amazement. I've never seen anything like it. Tony said, and I were just discussing the possibility of him joining the staff here. Tony's eyebrows shot up. Seriously, I thought you were looking for security work. I was, admitted. But maybe I was looking for the wrong kind of security. Maybe what I really need is the chance to build something positive instead of just protecting what already exists. Tony was quiet for a moment, his business owner's mind clearly calculating possibilities and risks. "The pay wouldn't be great to start," he said finally. "And restaurant work is physically demanding, high stress, long hours." "Sounds familiar," replied with a slight smile. "But," Tony continued, "if we can keep growing like we have been these past weeks, there's real potential here. Not just for profit, but for impact. What happened tonight? That was bigger than just serving good food." Looked around the kitchen that had become domain, thinking about the transformation he'd witnessed over the past few weeks. A homeless dragon woman had been given a chance to cook, and in doing so, she'd begun to heal not just her own wounds, but the deeper divisions left by war. "When do I start?" asked. Tony grinned. "How about tomorrow night? I'll put you on service, taking orders, serving tables, handling customer relations. Can focus on the kitchen, and you can be the bridge between her and the front of house." As they finalized the basic details of his employment, he felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. He would be helping to create something unprecedented, a place where former enemies could work together to nourish their shared communities. Outside, the city's neon lights painted the empty streets in familiar patterns of color and shadow. But inside Tony's all-night diner, 3 veterans from different backgrounds were planning a future that none of them could have imagined just weeks before. The war had ended 5 years ago, but perhaps the real peace was just beginning. 6 months after had found in that rain-soaked alley, Tony's all-night diner had become something neither of them could have imagined. The modest restaurant had expanded into the adjacent building, adding a formal dining room that complemented the original casual counter service. More importantly, it had become a symbol of post-war reconciliation that attracted visitors from across the galaxy. Adjusted his tie, still an uncomfortable necessity for his new role as general manager, and surveyed the controlled chaos of the kitchen during the dinner rush. Moved through her domain with the fluid grace of someone completely at peace with her environment, directing a staff that now included 2 human sous chefs, a pastry specialist, and a young draconian apprentice named who had arrived 3 weeks ago with a story remarkably similar to his. The dining room buzzed with conversations in a dozen languages. At one table, a delegation of human diplomats shared appetizers with their counterparts, their formal peace negotiations temporarily forgotten in favor of marveling at quantum molecular gastronomy. Near the windows, a group of human and draconian war veterans ate together, their initial awkwardness gradually dissolving into shared laughter and stories. But tonight was special, tonight was nervous. Ambassador of the Terran Diplomatic Corps was dining in the private room upstairs, along with War Marshal of the Reformed Draconian Republic. Their presence at the diner wasn't accidental. Both had been instrumental in arranging what Tony had dubbed the Feast of Understanding, an experimental diplomatic dinner designed to demonstrate how former enemies could work together toward common goals. The stakes were enormous. If successful, the dinner would serve as a model for similar initiatives across the galaxy. If it failed, the backlash could destroy everything they'd built. Checked his watch and headed upstairs to the private dining room. Through the doorway, he could see Ambassador, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s whose reputation for tough negotiating was legendary, engaged in animated conversation with War Marshal, whose massive frame and ceremonial battle scars spoke to decades of military service. "Mr. Ambassador said as entered, I wanted to thank you personally for arranging this evening. The preliminary reports about this establishment have been intriguing." "The pleasure is ours," Ambassador replied. "Though I should clarify that tonight's menu was entirely designed by our head chef. She's created something specifically for this occasion that she calls the Unity Course 7 dishes that represent the culinary traditions of all the major species involved in the recent conflicts." War Marshal leaned forward with interest. "I have heard remarkable things about this. Is it true that she served as a flame singer in the 3rd Legion?" "It is," confirmed, "under the command of battle leader during the 7 campaign." His expression shifted to something approaching reverence. "Was my clutch brother. He spoke often of his flame singers, particularly one whose precision was so remarkable that she could cook a meal while standing in the middle of a firefight." He paused. "Is she? Would it be possible to meet her?" Had anticipated this request. "She's preparing your meal personally. I'm sure she'd be honored to speak with you afterward." What didn't mention was that had been nearly paralyzed with anxiety when she'd learned of attendance. The war marshal wasn't just any draconian dignitary. He was a living legend whose military innovations had prolonged the war by at least 2 years. For meeting him represented a confrontation with both her past service and the broader implications of her current work. The first course arrived carried by, who moved with the careful precision of someone still adjusting to working in close proximity to humans. The dish was visually stunning, a spiral arrangement of proteins and vegetables that seemed to shift color in the light, accompanied by what appeared to be liquid starlight in delicate crystal glasses. Molecular memory foam protein with quantum-locked nutrients, explained in carefully practiced English. Chef has recreated the taste profiles of home-world dishes from 7 different species, combined into a single harmonious composition. Ambassador took a careful bite and her eyes widened immediately. How is this possible? I can taste my grandmother's Sunday roast, but there's also something else, something that reminds me of. Home, War Marshal finished quietly. He had been staring at his plate with an expression of profound amazement. She has somehow captured the essence of nest fire cooking, the way food tastes when prepared over the sacred flames of Draconis Prime. The subsequent courses followed the same pattern. Each dish triggered powerful emotional responses in the diners, evoking memories of childhood comfort foods while simultaneously introducing them to completely new flavor experiences. Watched from the corner of the room as 2 of the galaxy's most influential leaders gradually relaxed their diplomatic guards, sharing personal stories triggered by culinary artistry. By the 5th course, a dessert that somehow managed to taste like both human chocolate cake and honey crystals, Ambassador was laughing openly at one of stories about his military academy days. "This is remarkable," she said during a brief pause between courses. "I've been to state dinners on 50 planets, but I've never experienced anything like this. Your chef isn't just preparing food, she's creating empathy." Nodded, understanding exactly what the ambassador meant. Had explained her philosophy to him weeks earlier. Food was the most intimate form of communication, carrying not just nutrients but emotions, memories, and cultural identity. By creating dishes that honored multiple traditions simultaneously, she was demonstrating that understanding didn't require abandoning one's own heritage. The 7th and final course arrived just as the city's lights were beginning to twinkle in the darkness outside. It was the simplest-looking dish of the evening, what appeared to be basic bread and soup, but knew from its preparation that appearances were deceiving. "This course represents sustenance during conflict," explained. Chef has recreated the emergency rations that soldiers from all species carried during the war, but enhanced with techniques that transform survival food into comfort food. War Marshal took a spoonful of the soup and froze. For several seconds he sat completely still, his massive frame trembling slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. This tastes exactly like the field rations my unit shared on 7, but somehow," he took another spoonful, his eyes closing, "somehow it doesn't taste like desperation anymore, it tastes like hope." Ambassador had a similar reaction to the bread, which apparently replicated the compressed nutrition bars that human soldiers had survived on during the siege of New Geneva. "How did she know?" she whispered. "How did she know exactly what this should taste like?" Realized that this was the moment he'd been waiting for, the opening that would allow the evening's real purpose to unfold. "Perhaps you should ask her yourself," he suggested. "Chef has been hopping for the opportunity to speak with both of you." When entered the private dining room, she moved with the controlled grace that had learned to associate with her moments of greatest anxiety. She wore her cleanest chef's whites and had polished her scales until they gleamed, but could see the tension in her posture. "War Marshal Ambassador," she said formally, bowing to each in turn. "I am honored that you chose to experience my cuisine." "Chef," Ambassador replied, "what we've experienced tonight goes far beyond cuisine. You've created something that I believe could fundamentally change how our species interact with each other." Was staring at with an expression of intense curiosity. "You served under my clutch brother," he said. "He spoke of you often in his final transmissions." His composure wavered slightly. He was a good commander. He tried to minimize casualties on both sides whenever possible. "Yes," agreed. He believed that honorable conduct during war was the foundation for honorable peace afterward. He paused, studying face. He also believed that his flame singers were artists forced to become weapons. He said you could create beauty even in the midst of destruction. Yes, admitted quietly. Even during the worst battles, I would sometimes use my flames to cook simple meals for my unit. It helped us remember that we were more than just instruments of war. Ambassador leaned forward intently. Chef, what you've accomplished here, this restaurant, tonight's dinner, represents something unprecedented. You've created a space where former enemies can not only coexist but actively collaborate to create something beneficial. The Terran Diplomatic Corps is interested in supporting similar initiatives, added. As is the Draconian Republic. We believe that cultural exchange through cuisine could be more effective than traditional diplomatic negotiations in building lasting peace. Sighs widened. You want to expand this model. We want to fund it, Ambassador clarified. Restaurants like this one on major worlds throughout both our territories. Cultural exchange centers where former soldiers from all species can find new purposes while helping to build understanding between their peoples. Felt his heart racing. What they were describing would transform not just life, but the lives of thousands of veterans struggling to find their place in a post-war galaxy. There would be conditions, continued. The restaurants would need to employ veterans from multiple species. They would serve as informal diplomatic outposts, hosting cultural events and educational programs. Most importantly, they would need to maintain the same commitment to authenticity and reconciliation that we've witnessed here tonight. Was quiet for a long moment, her golden eyes moving between the two diplomats. This restaurant, this opportunity, it saved my life, she said finally. If we can create similar opportunities for others. You could save thousands of lives, Ambassador finished, and in doing so help heal the deeper wounds that formal peace treaties can't address. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details, funding mechanisms, and selection criteria for potential locations. Found himself taking notes on his tablet, his mind racing with the implications of what was being proposed. As the evening drew to a close, War Marshal requested one final favor. Would it be possible to meet with your kitchen staff? He asked. Particularly young, I knew his clutch parents during the war. In the kitchen, the reunion between and was profoundly moving. The young Draconian broke down in tears as the War Marshal shared stories about his family's service and sacrifice during the conflict. Watched comfort her apprentice while simultaneously maintaining her cooking schedule, and he was struck once again by her remarkable capacity for both strength and compassion. She's extraordinary, Ambassador said quietly, joining near the kitchen doorway. When we first heard about this place, we expected to find a curiosity, an interesting cultural anomaly that might be worth studying. Instead, we've discovered something that could reshape how our civilizations relate to each other. Nodded, watching Guide through the preparation of late-night orders while continuing her conversation with about traditional Draconian cooking techniques. 6 months ago, she was convinced she was worthless. Now look at her. What changed? The Ambassador asked. Thought about that question for a moment. Someone gave her the chance to be herself, he said finally. Not the person the war had forced her to become, but the person she'd always been underneath. And once she remembered who that was, everything else became possible. As the last customers finished their meals and the kitchen crew began their closing routines, found himself standing in the dining room, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the future. In 6 months, they'd gone from a desperate attempt to help one homeless veteran to the foundation for a galaxy-wide reconciliation program. Approached him as he stood by the windows. Her chef's whites traded for casual clothes that made her look younger and more relaxed than had ever seen her. Nervous about tomorrow? She asked, settling into the booth beside him. Laughed, terrified, he admitted. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in shelters and getting rejected for security jobs. Now I'm supposed to help coordinate an interstellar restaurant chain. 6 months ago, I was starving in an alley, pointed out. Now I'm supposed to train chefs from 7 different species. Growth is terrifying, but the alternative is staying broken. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the late-night traffic flow through the streets below. Finally, spoke again. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found me that night? Considered the question seriously. I think about it a lot, actually. Not just what would have happened to you, but what would have happened to me. Meeting you, helping you find your purpose, it helped me find mine too. The war took so much from all of us, said softly. Our homes, our families, our sense of who we were supposed to be, but maybe the point wasn't to get back what we'd lost. Maybe the point was to build something completely new. Nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The restaurant around them wasn't just a business. It was proof that healing was possible, that former enemies could become colleagues and friends, that the skills learned in war could be transformed into tools for peace. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to show on the horizon. Soon, the breakfast shift would begin, and the cycle of service that had become the heart of their new lives would start again. But for now, in the quiet moments before another day began, allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced since before the war, genuine hope for the future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to prove that the bonds forged in kitchen heat were stronger than the divisions carved by ancient conflicts. But tonight, for the first time in years, that felt like an adventure rather than a burden. The homeless dragon woman who had whispered, "I'm worthless, but I can cook," was gone forever, replaced by someone who had found her true value not in spite of her past, but because of how she'd chosen to transform it. And in helping her make that transformation, had discovered that healing others was the most effective way to heal himself. The war was over. The real victory was just beginning.